In this video, we'll go over Bootstrap cards and how you can use them to build responsive layouts. So the first question you might ask is, what is a card? A card in general is used to represent an item in a list or an array. We used to commonly do this thing with a table. Problem with a table, it's not mobile responsive. So we switched over to using cards anytime we want to display a list of things, because that can be easily made to be responsive rather than a table. Okay, so if we're thinking about common examples of cards actually appear all over the internet. So for instance, if we're thinking about Twitter, each tweet is a card. It's a thing, right? If we're looking at Pinterest, each image that you see on Pinterest is a card. If I'm looking at my YouTube suggested feed, my suggested videos, each of those is a card. It's a thing, right? If I'm looking at Yelp, my cards might be places. If I'm looking at social media, I might see cards. Cards containing posts or comments. If I'm looking at some sort of news media, I might see a list of articles, and each of those could be represented as a card. Or if I'm looking at e-commerce, maybe I'm making a store where I'm selling cowboy boots. Well, in that case, each of the items would be, each of your products would be represented by a card. So the thing to keep in mind is the reason we're doing this is that it creates a good responsive behavior. But each of these cards then need to be kind of self-contained, right? They need to not depend on any of the cards in the list. Okay, but they all represent items. Okay, one of the things that you get with a card by default is you get a nice border around a card, so to easier represent that it's a thing. Sometimes people make the mistake of just putting in a card anytime they want a border, right? Don't just add a card if all you want is a border. Use a border if you need a border. But to represent a thing, use a card. A card represents a thing. So Bootstrap cards provide a very flexible and extensible container with multiple variants and options. There's a lot of different ways to configure and build and design a card. There's a whole lot of ways that you can manipulate them for your specific needs, because all items are different. They have different attributes. They have different layouts that make sense, and it may make sense to have the layout be one way for mobile. It may be different to have it on desktop. But the idea is that they're kind of a contained block that represent a thing. So they're very flexible. They're very extensible. They have a body. They typically always have a body, but you can also add in some optional headers and some optional footers. You can put any content really you want into them, so they can contain a wide variety of content. And there's a lot of different display options that you can get into and play around with, including all the utilities that we talked about in the intro to Bootstrap. So let's look at a basic card. So a basic card consists of at least two pieces. So on the outside, you need to have the card class. Okay, so the card class, that's where the whole thing starts. And then inside of that is where you have the content of your card. So for instance, in this case, I don't have any headers, I don't have any footers, I just have a body to the card. Okay, so my simple version here, I have the card class, I have the card body, okay, so that represents the text inside. It's worth noting that the card is what actually has the border. That's what comes with the border styling. The card body is what adds the spacing between the outer border of the card and the inner content of the card. So the space that you're seeing here between this text and the border, that space is created by the card body. If you just have the card without the card body, that text would go all the way to the edge of the border. Okay. You'll also notice then that I have the card text class. The card text class is probably the easiest one to omit without major noticeable effects. Generally speaking, the card text by itself does very little, but where it comes in is when you want to theme the card. Oftentimes when you want to theme the card, you want to target the text on a card and change the color or change the font of it a bit. So having the card text there makes it much easier to change the text on the card. So you can see the card body is a div. You can see the card is a div. You'll also notice, though, however, the card text is actually a paragraph tag because it represents the card, the actual text on the card. So one of the things to keep in mind, the card text shouldn't be applied to just anything. The card text class should only be applied to things that just contain text. Okay. If you have any sort of other content inside of there, then you don't want to give it the card text class. You only want to give it the card text class if there's actually text inside of it. And you want to give that card text as close down in the hierarchy as you can. Okay, and that's why we have it separate from the card body, because the card body is everything in the body, versus the card text is just the text inside of the body. Okay, I can also add titles and subtitles to my cards. So for instance, here I have a card title. You can see in the example it's card title, card subtitle. You can see that the card subtitle is a slightly more faded and smaller. So we have card title is the class that's being applied here. Both of these in this case all of this is in the card body. So the card body actually contains the card title, the subtitle, and the card text. So here we have card title. That's an H5. The way it's set up, that doesn't have to be an H5. You set it up based on what makes sense for your context, but make sure you're following the appropriate semantic rules. So we've got the card title, and then we've also got the card subtitle. Okay, so that's what's listed here. Card title, card subtitle. So we got an H5, we got an H6. Those aren't going to be an H5 and H6 all the time. Make sure you're using, whatever makes sense there. I am setting the margin on the bottom here. You can see MB2. Usually when you're using these in context of card, the default margin may not make a lot of sense, especially when I want the card title to be up really close to the card subtitle. So if I left the default margin, there's actually a lot of default margin on the H5. So if I didn't change that, then the card title and subtitle would actually be pretty far apart. So that's why we're setting MB2 there. And then you'll also notice we're setting text muted on the subtitle, and that's what's making it more muted. Okay, so that doesn't come out of the box. Those are things that we have to add typically to our cards. So we've got a card with a title, a subtitle, and a card text. And so far, if we're looking at the card this way, it may look like, well, really all I'm doing is adding some margin and adding a border around this box and some margin between the border and the content. And that's where people get oftentimes confused and think, well, all the card is a border, so I should use the card anytime I have need of a border of that kind of layout. Again, really, you should only use the card in the case where it represents an item. Okay, if it represents an item in a list, then use the card. If it's anything else, right? If you want a border, then just use the border classes or write your own CSS to style that. Only use the cards when that is what you're trying to represent, because that's what they're for. Okay. So sometimes I want to give my cards a border. As we saw in the previous example, I had my title and my subtitle. They were both inside of the body. But I can add an additional header here, and you'll see once I've added the header that there's a line here, and that header is a slightly different color, which I can configure the color of that header by using the background utility classes, which we talked about at the beginning of this. But here I've moved the card title and the card subtitle. I've moved them into that head. So you can either have the title and the subtitle in the body, in which case you don't get that division, or they can be in the head. This is part of where cards become really flexible, because that header is completely optional. And just because you want a title doesn't mean you have to have a header. Okay. You'd also have an optional footer. Similar to how we added the card header up before the card body, we can add a card footer at the end, and you can see I've got 2 days ago in the bottom of that. So in this case here, we have a card with a body and a footer, but no header, right? So we can do that. That's fine. You'll also notice that the footer has that same line, that same division as the header, as well as that slightly off-white color. Okay. I can also build cards with both of those. If I want to have a header, a body, and a footer, then maybe I put all three of those things together. So for instance, here I've got a card with a header, and a body and a footer. You'll also notice that I don't have to put a title and a subtitle actually really anywhere on the card. Those things aren't required either. So all of these pieces you can mix and match as what makes sense to you. Now, and typically I would say you always want to start with the card outside, and your cards are always going to have a body. I would say that your card should always have a body. You probably don't want to have just a header or just a footer, but having just a body is perfectly fine, perfectly normal. Okay. So let's say we want to add a button to our card. Okay. I might create a card like we've done previously. So I've got a card body, card title, right? Here I don't have any sort of subtitle. I've got my card text. And then finally at the bottom, I have a link with class button primary. That's fine. If you need to add a link or a button of any sort, you just add it like you would to the card body. You can also align your cards. So if I want to change how the whole card is aligned, I can add that to the card, the outer layer, and then it will be inherited by all the layers below. So for example here, if I set text center, everything in that card will be centered. Or I could put it left aligned and everything would be left aligned, or I could make it all right aligned. Now, I would say oftentimes you're probably going to put the alignment on the body itself, because if you do have a header or a footer, you probably want those still to be left aligned, or at least aligned more likely differently than how the body of the card is aligned. But if you don't want to align the entire card one way, you can put that on the outer layer, the outer container. So I can change the color of my cards. So if I set background primary, that will change the color, the background color of the card to a primary color. So I can do that like here, or I could change it to secondary, I could change it to success, danger, warning, info, light, etc. I can use those background colors to change the color of the card. Now, by default, though, the text color, as you saw with these previous examples, is normally a darker shade, usually black. So for some of these cards, as you see here, primary, secondary, success, danger, info, dark, oftentimes you also have to change the color of the text using those text color classes like text white. So in this case, with the primary color, I've not just changed the background, I've also changed the text, the color, the color of the text, so the text is readable. So oftentimes you have to change those two things together, the color of the text as well as the background color. Now, some of your cards you may want to add images to, and adding an image to the top of a card is super easy. Now, you just add the image tag. Notice I've added it before the body. Remember, the body includes the padding that brings it in. So because I've added it before, because I've added it outside of the body, it can get all the way to the edge of the card. So here I've given it the card image top, and it sets nicely into the top part of the card. You can even see it fits into the rounded corners in the top left and right of the card if you look closely. I can also add an image to the bottom of the card. In that case, I'm going to give it class card image bottom. So putting it at the top of the bottom is really easy, and most of our cards, especially because they represent things, especially if you're thinking about like products in your store, they're probably going to include an image. So a lot of your cards will include an image, or tweets might include an image. Now, you can also include images on the left and right, but it is a little bit harder. To include images on the left and right, there's not really a easy built-in way to do it. Like we have card image top and card image bottom. So to put things on the left and right, we actually have to fall back to the grid system that we talked about in the previous video. So in this case here, I'm using that grid system to place these two things next to each other on larger screen sizes. So here we have, I've added in an additional row, right? So inside of the card, I have a row. I have this class no gutters. Now, by default, there is some, whenever I'm using the grids system, there is some space between each of the columns, which is called the gutter. But in this case, I don't want that gutter space because it creates kind of some odd behaviors. It creates too much extra space between the image and the body of the card. So I don't actually want that gutter, which is why I'm setting no gutters to set that gutter to 0. Okay, so that's actually an important little trick in there. And no gutters is not something we use very often because usually that spacing is helpful. But in this particular case, that spacing between columns is not helpful. So the first item we've got in here, we've got column MD4. So I'm saying on medium or larger, this should take up 4 out of 12 columns. So that means by default, at medium or larger, this is going to be a third of the space. So a third of the space of the width of the card will be devoted to the image. And then I've got column MD8. So that's going to be 2/3 is the body of the card. And I could, adjust those numbers if I want more image and less text. But that's how I would do that if I wanted it 1/3 and 2/3. I could flip that around and say maybe I want column MD8 on the left, and that would give it that would give the image 2/3 of the space and the text 1/3. But that really depends on what kind of content you're putting in there and whether the image is more important than the text or the text more important. Also in there, notice that I've set MD4 and MD8. Remember that means that it's going to have that behavior at medium or larger. But by default, it's going to go back to call 12. So if this is less than, if the way that this is set up, if it's smaller than medium, if the viewport is narrower than a medium screen size, then they're going to appear vertically. So in this case, it's actually going to fall down on mobile, where the image will be on the top and the text will be on the bottom. So we can use the advantage and the flexibility of that responsive grid here to implement these things. Now, one quirk of getting images to be on the left. To have an image on the left, you can't really easily use an image tag, unfortunately. In order to make it work, you really do have to change the image to be a background image. And that's kind of unfortunate in here. But the problem is we don't have as much control with an actual image tag as we have with using the background image property. So the way I'm going to set this up here, I'm going to say set the background image to whatever my image is that I want to use. And then I need to set it to center/cover. So center is the positioning, cover is the size. So that says put the image in the center of the space that's available, but stretch the image so it covers that entire space. So there's no leftover white space, and that makes it fit in here nicely. I've also had to set the minimum height. In this case, I set it to 300. And the reason I needed to do that, if I didn't give this image a minimum height, then two things would happen. First of all, on desktop here, the image would only be as tall as the text. If I didn't set a minimum height, the image would only be as tall as the text. And then on mobile, remember it's turning and becoming vertical, so the image is going on top. If I didn't set a minimum height, then the height of that area would be close to 0, minus a little bit of padding. So in order to make that image actually be visible when you go to mobile, that minimum height is needed to make sure that the image has some space to actually be rendered. Okay. I can also change this to have the image on the right. And there's two ways to do this. I could either move the image down to the bottom, and down to the bottom, and I could change it so that, okay, we'll do the body first and then do the image, and that would give me an image that's on the right. But then when it goes down to mobile, that would mean the image goes down to the bottom instead of going to the top. So what if I want the image to be able to be on the right on desktop, but I want it to be on the top on mobile? Well, then I can use the flex order classes to make that happen. So here I'm saying by default, when it's on mobile, which is a starting point, it's going to be on top and bottom. Remember, when you're reading the HTML, that's the arrangement, that's the normal arrangement of it on mobile. So then in desktop, if it's a medium or larger, I'm saying move this, because it's got an order of 1, then starts out with an order of 0, goes to an order of 1, that will actually move this after the div, after the body. So that's where, by moving this after the body, but only moving it there on medium or larger, it becomes on the right. So if I did want it to be underneath on mobile, then I could go ahead and just put it underneath. But because I want it to be on top and on mobile and on the right on the desktop, that's where I have to manipulate the order. Okay. There are a lot more examples of how to work with cards up on the Bootstrap website. You can follow a link here to go find more. And I'll see you in the next video.